Hi, everybody. This is Danielle Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario, in Canada for webyeshiva.org. We are at the Bayit Beth Avram Yosef of Toronto Congregation, and we've been studying Moreh Nevukhim, Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. We are in section 2 of the Moreh Nevukhim. Chapter 19 is what we're beginning today. It is a bit of a lengthier chapter. So we'll probably take 2 sessions today and next week, which will be our last session before Pesach, before Passover, and then we'll take a break. And hopefully we'll finish chapter 19 next week. Because of its length and because of its method of argumentation, I do have an outline for the first half of or a little bit more than the first half of the chapter for you today, and I will share my screen with you. Those who are able to see the video, you can watch the outline as we describe it, or you can always download it from the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim for today's class, or you can download it from the course description on the webyeshiva.org website. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is just to read the opening paragraph in the text itself. We'll do a couple of readings today. We are on page 302 in the Shlomo Pines edition of the Moreh Nevukhim. And he starts as follows. It is clear to you just to get our bearings, the Rambam has been pushing back on Aristotle's theory of an eternal universe and using different arguments to demonstrate that the narrative of creation as it appears in the Torah is the more correct way of understanding how the universe came into existence. And before the Rambam uses further argumentation to bolster the side of creation, he is further going to deconstruct and dismantle the Aristotelian model of an eternal universe in chapter 19. And the approach that the Rambam is using is an argument from particularization in this entire chapter. What does particularization mean? We had seen this discussion back in section 1 in chapter 73 and 74. And what the argument of particularization essentially means is that when we look at the universe that is around us, both in what we would call the sublunary world, the physical world that we experience, plus our observations of the metaphysics of the celestial realm, which according to Aristotle is made up of a completely different type of matter, we notice that there are certain particular features of different components of reality. And the question that we always have to ask ourselves is, why is it this way and not another way? Why did God particularize the world this way and not another way? And the general argument that the Rambam is going to present can be synopsized in point number 1 of our outline. The basic difference between the eternal universe model and the creation model is as follows. If you believe in an eternal universe, then reality, all that exists, is a natural emanation of the deity, which perforce, meaning all of existence, must be the way it is. That is, there was no will or volition of a deity that caused it to be the way it is. Everything is a natural and eternal emanation from the most perfect being. By contrast, if you believe in creation, then a creator of will decided volitionally, in other words, consciously, to make things one way and not another way. There was nothing that forced God to create in any one particular way, because the way the universe appears to us was a conscious decision by a creator and not something that perforce emanated from a perfect being. Now, noticing that there are certain aberrations, nothing is like perfect in our reality. So the question that we have to ask is, if you believe in an eternal universe, which is a natural emanation from a perfect deity, Why are there so many idiosyncrasies and things that just don't seem to be arbitrary in the way that they were chosen? Why are certain things a certain color, a certain texture? Why are they the way that they are? And the Rambam is going to use this method of argumentation to demonstrate that it's simply illogical to believe that the universe came about and has existed eternally this way as a necessary byproduct of God. It can't be necessary because otherwise, why is it the way that it is and not another way? So we're just going to read in the text itself from the Pines edition. It is clear to you from the doctrine of Aristotle, as well as from that of everyone who affirms the eternity of the world, that in his view, meaning in Aristotle's view, that which exists has proceeded from the Creator in virtue of a necessity. That he, may he be exalted, is a cause and this world an effect, and it was necessary that this should be so. Just as one does not ask with regard to him, may he be exalted, why he exists or how he exists thus, I mean to say as one and incorporeal, so it may not be asked with regard to the world as a whole, why it exists or how it exists thus, meaning because it's a natural outgrowth of of God. For all this, both the cause and the effect exist thus necessarily, and non existence is not possible with regard to them in any respect, nor their changing from the way they exist. Hence, it follows necessarily from this opinion that of necessity everything must remain permanently as it is, according to its nature, and that nothing can change as far as its nature is concerned. For according to this opinion, it is impossible that a thing from among the existence should change as far as its nature is concerned. Accordingly, no thing has come into being in virtue of the purpose of one possessing purpose. What he means by the word purpose is will. And the term in Hebrew is kavanah, or kavanat hamechavein, the intent, the deliberate intention of a being of intent or a being of will. So therefore, nothing has come into being in virtue of the intent of one possessing intent who chose freely and willed that all things should be as they are. That's the view of Aristotle. And as I will demonstrate, says the Rambam, point number 2, we shall make arguments that are close to demonstration. That's a direct quote from the Rambam, proving that that which exists came into being through a willful decision of a creator using this argument of particularization. Why are things one way and not another way? Now, the third point that the Rambam makes, and we're going to see this, we're just going to go over this outside, is the Rambam says, I shall not align myself with the arguments of the Mutakalimun, because they have argued against basic Aristotelian rules of physics. And here what the Rambam is doing is he's hearkening back to chapter 73 and 74 of the first section, where in particular, the Mutakalimun, which is a competing system of philosophy, had argued they, that they had made certain premises in chapter 73, and based on those premises, they came up with philosophical conclusions about God acting as a creator. One of the premises is that atoms make up everything. They were atomists, and they believed that the universe is comprised of very, very tiny, unchanging little packets of reality. And but probably the most outlandish thing for the Rambam that the Mutakalimun said is that anything imaginable is possible. That is, that according to them, there are no such things as rules of physics. Everything can be broken. You can have it is possible, according to them, to have a square whose hypotenuse is equal in length to one of its sides. You can have geometric anomalies and impossibilities existing as long as you can imagine them to be possible. And so these and other of their premises lead them to prove by particularization, namely, why are things one way and not the other, that there was a creation. I mean, after all, if you're able to suggest that anything imaginable is possible, then the possibilities of what creation would look like are virtually infinite, are virtually endless. Um, so the Rambam is basically saying that while I too subscribe to the argument of particularization, I nonetheless confine myself to maintaining the laws of physics and natural science when making this argument. I'm not suggesting that God had to create the world, could have created the world in any way that he wanted. No, God certainly was confined, or confined himself, more properly said, to a certain set of rules of physics, which the Mutakalimun do not agree to. And that's our point of departure, is basically what he's saying. I maintain that God confines himself to the laws of natural science, and we will still be stuck trying to figure out why the world exists in the way it does versus another way. We're going to get into some examples. The basic premise to which everyone agrees, says the Rambam, this is point number 4, is that when multiple objects possess the same matter but different properties, there must be a cause other than the common matter which makes each object different from each other. And so therefore, the very bottom of page 303, he says, I, on the other hand, shall establish particularization regarding the things with respect to which it ought to be established by means of philosophic premises derived from the nature of that which exists. That was the point in point number 3. And he says, this is point number 4, I shall explain this method after first setting forth this premise. In every case in which things differing in any way from one another possess a common matter, there must be of necessity be a cause other than and different from the common matter, a cause that rendered it necessary that some of the things have a certain attribute, whereas some others have a different one. If everything is made up of the same stuff, then why are certain things one way, either lighter or heavier, darker or lighter than other things? There may be several causes according to the number of the things differing from one another. This premise is unanimously agreed to both by those who believe in the eternity of the world and by those who believe in its having come and being at a time. And the Rambam is making reference here that even Aristotle has to agree that if you see two different items that are disparate from each other, but are made up of the same type of stuff, then you must conclude that something else contributed to their difference other than the material that was used to make them. And that's where we get into form and the combinations of different kinds of elements. So our first question to Aristotle is thus: if all matter beneath the moon sphere is the same, it's made up of the same prime matter that Aristotle had discussed. The Rambam had cited this before, that prime matter breaks down into 4 different elements. Why are things so disparate? Um, and so Aristotle answers this question, and this is on page 304. He gives us an answer to this, saying, the cause of the differences lies in the changes in the mixture of the compounds composed of this matter. And if we take a look just at point number 6 in our outline, he says there are 4 different elements. And how are these 4 different elements? How do they come into being? How do 4 elements separate from one primal element? He says the different proportions of mixtures of these elements contributes to the differences of the various things found in existence. Elaine, if I could please ask you to mute yourself. Thank you. And he says all matter is acted upon by the forms of heat, coldness, dryness, and moisture. Each of the 4 elements is comprised of 2 of these forms, meaning that when we look at the elemental material that makes up all the different things in this world, we will discover that the elements are influenced by different forms that enter into the elements, making them unique from each other. So the forms that he's referring to are what we would call, let's say, features of or attributes. For example, fire is made up of heat and dryness. Wind is made up of heat and moisture. Water is made up of heat and coldness, and earth is made up of dryness and coldness. The elements are combined into compound materials based on the degree of these forms that act upon them and cause them to combine with other elements, resulting in all the diversity of existence. Now, that's the way Aristotle would explain to us that even though all of existence in our sublunary world starts off with basically the same stuff that makes it, we know that certain external conditions act upon this prime matter and break it down into 4 different elements based upon different conditions of coolness, dryness, and heat and moisture. And then once these elements are broken down into their 4 different elements, they combine together in different proportions to make all of the different disparate things that we find in our world. But we then have to question Aristotle. What causes some of the prime matter to receive the form of fire, while other matter receives the form of earth, water, and air? Why is it, or how does that come into being? If everything starts off as prime matter, which is basically neutral, how is it that some of that stuff becomes water and some of that stuff becomes air? How does that happen? Now, of course, all of this can be addressed from a scientific analysis of its molecular or atomic structure, but that is anathema to the Rambam, who was living in an Aristotelian world of science, not in a Newtonian world of science. So Aristotle would answer this question by saying that each matter's form is dependent upon its position vis-a-vis the sphere or the earth. Meaning, why certain parts of the material of prime matter become air, whereas others become earth or water, for example, is because there is a difference in its positioning as far as how close it is to the heavenly sphere versus how close it is to the center of the earth. If a particular matter is closer to the sphere, it will obtain form that is closer to heat and dryness, and it'll be more ethereal and light filled. Whereas if it is closer to the earth, it will obtain form that is closer to coldness and moisture, and it will be denser and darker. The Rambam concedes the soundness of this argument because in his time, this was believed to be demonstrated scientifically that different um, uh, types of prime matter break down into different elements based on the proximity of those items to either a higher point closer to the heavens or at a lower point closer to the earth. And therefore form embeds within them, making them either heavier or lighter, more ethereal or more dense. We then ask Aristotle, is the matter contained within the heavenly spheres the same as the matter contained with our sublunary existence? And Aristotle responds that no, of course not. Now, this question is implicitly suggesting if the matter of the spheres is different, why should the matter of our world be affected by the different matter of the sphere? And furthermore, we may suggest that this is part of the challenge. Why should there be a diversity of forms in the heavens which are not affected by proximity to either the spheres or the earth? In other words, I can understand the laws of physics in my world, in this sublunar existence, but why should there be diversity? Why should there be disparateness of celestial bodies if they're not governed by the same rules of physics as we are in our world? And Aristotle responds that the matter of the heavens is decidedly different from that of earth. And that was something that the Rambam was emphatic about, that we must conclude that Aristotle is correct in this regard, that there is a fundamental difference between the matter that makes up our world versus the matter that makes up the celestial realm. And this can be demonstrated by the nature of the motion of heavenly bodies, which always move in a circular motion, whereas bodies of our Earth move in a linear motion, or what Pines calls a rectilinear motion, but it's the same basic idea, either up or down or side to side. We do not see things in our realm rotating naturally. You either take a rock and drop it from a high point to a low point and it travels in a straight line, or you see a bird flying in a straight line, or you see air or fire rising up straight in a straight line. So we agree with his assertion, says the Rambam, everything he got it is correct. But then the Rambam states as follows, and this is point number 11, but we must still distinguish between the common matter of Earth, which causes things to move in certain ways, versus the disparate forms of earthly matter, which causes some things to move upward, others downward, some quickly and some slowly. In other words, this dichotomous structure of form and matter that is writ large in Aristotelian science, we must conclude that while there are certain common features of all things within our sublunary existence, that things move in a linear direction, but why is it that some things move upwards and some things move downwards? Why is it that some things move quickly and some things move slowly? It must be that there are different forms, like we discussed before, based upon the proximity of an element's closeness or distance from the heavenly sphere or the earth that makes it behave based on its unique form in different ways. Similarly, if we're going to make the same argument for the celestial realm, the common matter of the celestial bodies causes them all to move circularly, in a circular way. But some bodies move circularly from east to west, while others from west to east. And some celestial bodies move slowly, and some more rapidly. This indicates to us that the forms of the heavenly bodies are disparate and not the same. And here is the dilemma that we must present to Aristotle. I challenge Aristotle point number 12. Where does all this form particularization come from? I can understand why there is a breakdown and a disparateness within our realm, but why should there be a disparateness in the celestial realm? What influence is there in the celestial realm, which is not governed by the laws of physics in our world? Totally different rules of physics based on different matter, based on a totally different environment. Why then are there unique things that behave differently from each other, i.e., they are particularized in the celestial realm? Must we not conclude that there is a God who decides volitionally what form each celestial body will receive? Now, and that's really the Rambam's big challenge. And before we get to point number 13, let's read from page 306. He says, "Here I shall call your attention." This is the bottom paragraph on page 306 in the Pines edition. "Here I shall call your attention to the depth of Aristotle's penetration and to his extraordinary apprehension and to the extent to which this objection undoubtedly pressed hard upon him, so that he wished to escape from it by recourse to means in which the nature of that which exists did not help him." In other words, Aristotle was very clearly aware that this is a huge challenge to his whole scientific model. And he doesn't have a good answer because nature argues against him. And despite his best efforts, nature works against his responses. And Aristotle's objective was to try and demonstrate that just as there is order and natural reason to the disparate forms that exist in our world, there must also be a natural reason for the different forms in the heavens. And it wasn't because of some being who willed them to be one way or the other. But, concludes the Rambam, Aristotle failed in this endeavor. And I can only imagine how painful it must have been for the Rambam to write this, because the Rambam is a very, very devoted disciple of Aristotle. But ultimately, the Rambam, noting that Aristotle himself was aware of the weakness of his argumentation in this regard, must make this point because, of course, this is the one major point where Aristotle is at odds with the biblical narrative of creation. Okay, so what did Aristotle actually argue? Aristotle attempted to argue, this is point number 14, that the different celestial forms are because of their position vis-a-vis the highest sphere, or the outermost sphere that exists closest to the deity. He also attempted to argue why each of the 7 planets has its own sphere, whereas the multitude of stars share a common sphere of rotation. And what he's really referring to is there are multiple spheres that govern the rotation of different celestial bodies. And sign and observation in the medieval world demonstrated that each one of the planets, Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, Mars, etc., rotates within a separate sphere of rotation because the orbits of the various planets are all disparate from each other. Whereas there are clusters of stars that rotate in unison and are therefore considered to be under one sphere of rotation. And that in itself is a mystery. Why do the planets have, each one has a unique rotational sphere or orbit, whereas the stars move in clusters? He says he tries to argue this, he tries to make very sound argumentation for why that necessarily must be a natural emanation from the perfect deity. However, and this is a direct quote, he has accomplished none of these undertakings. We may accept his arguments regarding sublunary matter, meaning the stuff that makes up our world and why it possesses so many disparate forms based on different matter's position vis-a-vis the sphere of the earth. But this argument will not suffice for heavenly bodies, since some slower bodies are above the swifter ones, and vice versa. There appears to be no natural order behind the disparate behaviors and motions of the celestial bodies. And this brings us to point number 15. And we'll read it here. It's on page 307. And the points that the Rambam makes is to sum up. It was undoubtedly when Aristotle realized the feebleness of what he said in setting forth and expounding the bases and the causes of these things that he prefaced his starting upon these investigations with a statement that runs literally as follows. And in that statement, Aristotle made a claim. He said, and I'll just read it from my notes, in point number 15, he said that we need to speak concerning these kinds of investigations according to our intellects, which is translated as sichleinu, our knowledge, yediatenu, and our opinion, hashkafatenu. These three terms indicate his admission that his arguments were feeble. This is certainly so when considering the reduced knowledge of mathematics that existed in his time compared to ours. Now, what did the Rambam mean? What did Aristotle mean when he used three different terms to describe our intellects, our knowledge, and our opinion, or our point of view, our hashkafa? So before we get to that, let's just point number 16 that the Rambam makes in the interim is Aristotle also argued that each sphere contains its own intelligence, its own sentience. And that was part of the reason why Aristotle did that is to explain the reason for the particularization of the sphere's behaviors, because each sphere, as it were, has an independent sentience. But as I will argue later, he gains nothing by this, because ultimately, if everything emanates necessarily from one singular perfect deity, even the intelligences, then you don't have a sound reason why certain things are one way and other things are another way. Okay? So what did Aristotle mean, asks the Rambam, by these three terms, seichel, yedi'ah, and hashkafa? So the Rambam suggests as follows. When Aristotle says our opinion or our hashkafa, he means his need to reconcile the doctrine of an eternal universe. Because the word hashkafa, or our opinion, reflects a general outlook, a general overarching view of reality. And so Aristotle was basically saying, I've accepted the premise that the universe is eternal. And based on that accepted premise, I need to make everything fit within that premise. That already is an acknowledgement that there's something a bit weak about this method of argumentation, where you put the cart before the horse and you basically say, based on this premise, based on this assumption, I must make the following argumentation. Yedi'ah, our knowledge, means his need to demonstrate that everything happens for a reason and nothing is arbitrary. And finally, and that of course also is an outgrowth of Aristotle's assertion of an eternal universe, which emanates necessarily from an unthinking or unwilled deity who is not actively or volitionally creating, but rather just everything naturally emanates from that deity. And finally, sifleinu, our intellect, means that we do not have the ability to properly grasp the true nature of such lofty and perfect celestial existence. He therefore tried his best to explain whatever he could. And this last statement that the Rambam makes to explain what Sichlenu means is that the Rambam is basically inferring from the very language of Aristotle himself that Aristotle acknowledges that we simply don't get it. And even though he believes that the model of an eternal universe is correct, but there are still questions that remain unanswered once he commits himself to that kind of premise. And so the final point that we'll make, point number 18, is that Aristotle's argument for why certain celestial bodies move more slowly or quickly is truly bizarre. The Rambam doesn't go into it in any great depth. He just goes to the Rashi Prakim, just to the general points. His observations and theories regarding bodies that are more proximal to the eighth sphere, which is something that Aristotle writes about extensively, are also incorrect and inconsistent. He also did not have an adequate explanation for why certain bodies move from east to west and others from west to east. But astronomy and engaging in a little bit of apologetics and in defense of his mentor, the Rambam says Aristotle lived at a time where astronomy was underdeveloped. And because of its underdeveloped state within astronomy and mathematics, Aristotle came to certain conclusions that have since been proven to be incorrect based on scientific observation in our more advanced society. We do accept basic Aristotelian principles of science in the physical realm, but Aristotle's view of metaphysics and how things move and why things move the way they move simply have been debunked when we come to our modern era, says the Rambam. And therefore, this only further dismantles and weakens the whole model of an eternal universe. So that's where we're going to hold it for today at the bottom of page 308 in the Pines edition. And what we're going to conclude this chapter with just as a few more pages of text, is really just to point out that particularization, that is, why things are one way or not and not another, and why there's so much disparateness within existence, especially in regards to the celestial realm, definitely point to a divine being who at one point in time willed everything to be the way it is and particularized all of creation, not based upon some forced laws of nature, but rather because Hashem himself wanted the world to be in the way that it is. And certainly, once and we'll go through that text, Bezrat Hashem, next week, certainly those of us who understand that this world is not perfect, and that certainly was the Platonic view, when you understand that the world is an imperfect emanation from a perfect being, you certainly must come to that type of conclusion as well. But before we even get to that level of argumentation, let's hear the Rambam out and see what he says about how particularization definitely indicates creation. And that'll be something that we pick up on next time. Thanks for joining, and I hope that you're able to get something out of today's shir, even though it was somewhat technical. All right, have a good week, and I hope you enjoy your Pesach prep. Take care.